Greetings and welcome back to CS195 Web Development. This is week 7, CSS Layouts Part 2. Today's lesson, CSS Grid. So last lesson we learned how to use Flexbox and the setup of what you could really use it for, of being able to take those divs that want to go on top of each other and move them side by side with a certain type of setup. What was that setup? So the objective for this lesson is to utilize CSS Grid. We'll be able to complete a mini project using Grid, much like we did for layout, but this time you need to do it in Grid. So our success criteria is creating a web page using Grid to format the page versus Flexbox to format the page. Now I highly recommend coming back, watching this. Again, they all have their priorities and how they work better, but this is a nice little tutorial on that. But other than that, there's two main types of ways to do Grid. And there's a great explanation on why one's better or different than the other, and better is not necessarily always the right case. I mean, Flexbox is a lot easier to set up if that's what you need to do. But if you watch like the first 5 minutes of this advanced column, there's some good why it's better. Also, all the grid tutorials from the Net Ninja are down below. But let's go ahead. We'll start off with the grid area, and we'll kind of explain what it looks like and things you need to look out for. And then we'll go to grid columns. It's probably the more common method to do. But you can see right away, this is essentially like building a table, where this allows you to really get some interesting layouts in your settings. But everyone has their pros and cons. You can add stuff to make this look poor really quickly. So we'll watch this video, kind of go over this, and then we'll watch this video and explain kind of what you see over here, make some changes and whatnot to it, and then we'll go ahead and explain the mini project, which is very similar to the last one. So our first video.
And welcome to your second CSS Grid tutorial, and in this video we're going to introduce you to the concept of columns.
Psych. We're watching this video.
So arguably one of the coolest things about CSS Grid is that we can have grid template areas. And instead of me trying to explain what this means, because I'll probably fail, I just want to dive into an example which hopefully will show you how to use them, because they are freaking awesome, right? So the first thing you'll notice is that I've still got this div with an ID of content. That's our grid wrapper. Then we have these 6 tags inside it: header, main, section, aside, nav, footer. Now the styles are pretty much the same as all the other videos when we start, displaying grid on the content div right here, and then anything within that content div, anything that's a direct descendant, is given a background of this blue color and a padding of 30 pixels. So we have a grid kind of set up, but at the minute everything's stacking one on top of the other. Now I want to create a grid that maybe has, say, 4 columns that are all the same width, right? So let us first add in the grid -template -columns property, and this is going to be the repeat function. We want to repeat something 4 times, and it's going to be 1 fraction each, so each column is the same width. The next thing I want to do is give each row a certain height, or a minimum height. So I'll say grid auto rows, and by the way, I generally just do this so that the rows are big enough so that you can see. There's no other particular reason I'm giving it a min height of 100 pixels or something like that. But anyway, we'll say min max, and then oops, don't know what I've done there. Open the git panel, let's get rid of it. And inside here we want to say 100 pixels for the minimum and auto for the max, in case there's any content inside one of them. Alright, cool. So now we have that row height, and we want to start placing these different elements inside this grid in different places. Now the way we're going to do this is not how we'd generally do it over the past few tutorials, where we've said grid column start, or grid column is 1 to 5, or grid row is 1 to 3, etc. We're going to use grid template areas. So the idea is that we give each one of these different elements that we're going to position on the grid a grid area name, and then we position that grid area name inside this grid.
So this is a bit bigger of a setup. So a lot more you can do with it to make it look fancy, but there's a little bit more setup because it's just not like, hey, kind of like how the original grid is very similar to how Flexbox works. Is pretty much anything inside of it. Just you set up all your settings up here. This takes a little bit more because you're going to kind of build your template actually up at the top. So pay attention to how he names stuff and then actually has to give a little bit more information up top as well. So there's a little bit more setup on this one.
So first of all, let's give each one of these a grid area name, and we do this via CSS. So we'll say header and give this a property of grid-area, and we're going to set this equal to whatever we want to call this area that we're putting it in, right? And this is all going to make sense in a minute. Now, we don't have to pass this into quotations like a string or anything like that. We just call it right here, header, right? So I'm going to call this grid area for the header tag, header. Makes sense, right?
All right, and again, you could give these IDs, you could give them classes. In the example that I'm going to show you, it does classes, but the key is it's giving it CSS, and this is kind of like a variable is what it's giving it, right? It's saying, hey, anything with a header, give it the grid area variable of header, and we'll see what that means when they actually go to use it.
So I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the other things down here. So I'll say main, and this is going to have a grid hyphen area of main, and same thing for section, grid area section, and then same thing for, what have we got after section? We've got aside, nav, and footer. So I'll say aside, and then grid area is going to be aside. And this might not make much sense at the minute, but I promise you, in about 60 more seconds, it's all going to click into place. So grid area for this is going to be called.
Another thing to think that might not make a lot of sense, and even the example I do this, it's easier kind of remember, but sometimes I see students confusing the fact that, hey, I'm gonna use aside up at the top, but it's not because this is aside. It's because you gave aside the actual thing of aside, the variable of aside, right? You could call this, peanut butter for all the system cares. You just have to use a peanut butter up top. The key is if you forget this step and you're like, hey, all these other ones are working, I have a side up here. Why isn't it working? I have an aside down here. Well, the key is this is that middle step that gets forgotten. You didn't actually assign the grid area to a side. You didn't actually create the variable. Just because you have this actual element down here doesn't do you any good if you don't actually assign this, like I said, quote unquote variable. As we go a little farther, I'll point this out again, but this setup that he's doing right here is really important.
Called nav. So I'm just calling them the names of the tags here, but you don't have to call them that. You can call them whatever you want. For example, this one here, footer, I could say grid area is called my grid area, but whatever you want to call it. So I'm just calling them the same names as the tag because it's easier for me to remember. But anyway, now what we've done is assigned each of these different tags a grid area name, right? So now we can place these kind of grid areas onto the grid where we want to. And the way we distribute these different grid areas onto the grid is pretty simple. So all we need to do is come up to the grid itself, the grid wrapper, and we're going to use a property called grid template areas. So we'll say grid -template -areas. Okay, now our grid has 4 columns, right? And however many rows that we need. So what we can do now is spread out these different elements over these 4 columns. Now, what I'm going to do is a string for each different row, right? And on each row, what I'm going to do is say what I want to appear in each column, right? So there's 4 columns. So if I want, for example, the header to go all the way across the top, right? So over each of the 4 columns, then I can say in here for the first row, header, 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 and header. So,
right, so this is what I was talking about. He's using header because of this, not because of this. Just because he has, I can't scroll down just because he has the header HTML tag doesn't mean that he can call the header up here. He has to give the header a CSS rule with a property of grid area and a descriptor of header, right? So that's why he's able to use that. It's important to understand that.
So each one of these is a column, right? So I'm saying I want a header in the first column, header in the second, header in the third, header in the fourth. So now I can go on to the second row and I can say, well, okay, what do I want in the second row? Well, on the left, I want the aside, and I'll have the aside on the left again. So the first two columns, we have asides, which is this grid area down here, right? Then after aside, I want the main and the main. So on the right side of the second column, we have the main. So let's save this so far and see what happens. So we can see header, header, aside, main, right? Now it doesn't look brilliant yet, and you're going to find out why that is in a minute. It's just because we've not finished assigning these different things. But next, we'll go into the next row, and I'll say on the left, I'd like the nav. Then I want the nav again. Then main, then main. So the main is going over two rows right here. It's going on the right side of the second row and the right side of the third row, okay? Underneath this, I want another row, and this time we'll have section, 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 and section. And remember, these are the grid areas I'm putting in right here, whatever we've named them right here. So this section refers to this, and we're giving that a grid area name of section, and then we're placing that name in this row, right? So I don't just want this over one row, I want it over two rows, so I'll do another row full of sections, section, 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 okay? And then underneath that, we'll do one more row, and this is going to be for the footer, and we'll span that across the whole row as well. All right, so now I'm going to put a semicolon at the end of this because it's just a CSS property value at the end of the day. We put semicolons at the end of them, right? And I'm going to save this, and let's see what happens over here. So now you can see we have the header at the top, then we have the side on the left, nav on the left, the main, section and footer. I'm going to...
And if you had borders, you'd see this a little bit better, but this main is taking up this whole area. The section is taking up this whole area, 2 rows, right? And the side is just this half of it. So again, borders will kind of help, and we'll see that in our example pretty soon.
Let's just add a grid gap into this grid so you can see
that
this
will do that as well.
a little more clearly. So grid gap is going to be 10 pixels all the way around. Save that. Okay. So now we can see this take shape. Wherever we've placed those grid areas inside this thing, they appear on the screen, which is freaking awesome. So we're essentially dictating our layout using these grid template areas. We can visualize the layout right there. How simple.
Now we're gonna play with this a little bit, in the fact that we can actually see the change. And because look, we have this already. I'm gonna full screen this real quick. We can see this already. But again, look how this one works. We still have our grid container, just like we did for Flex, right? You'll see when we do the easier way, you don't need all these classes and stuff. You don't need to do all this stuff. Also, they made it in this example a little bit neater. You could, of course, do what he did as well, but because it's just one row and we wanted to get it all set up, they did it all in one. I mean, these are still just rules where it's saying, hey, item 1 is going to be called header. So instead of actually having a header tag and then naming it header, we're going to have a div item 1 that's going to end up being the header. Again, this is a header, so you can put an h1 in here, right? You can have your h1 in there, and now you have your header. So you actually put HTML in here, right? And again, there's this all examples, but if we were going to do this right, we'd actually set this up a lot better and give us our actual good syntax. So let's go ahead and take a little time and make this look pretty. So enter here. All right, so now we're starting to get good syntax and whatever we want. So if we want the menu is going to have a bunch of A tags in it. So maybe actually I just add a BR here, enter, and then do an A tag. All right, and of course this .com doesn't actually work, but all right, so the first page, you can click there for the first page. You're getting a bunch of text settings that are based on other settings that you have above this. So, but again, this is that grid template areas, just like he had. In this case, he didn't. This one's not using the columns. It's just saying, all right, I want 6 columns because I gave it 6 things. So the menu is one of those, main is 3 of those, or 3/5 of it, right? And then, or 3/6, so half of it. And then we got 2/6 and then 1/6. So obviously I'm saying 6 because if I change this to 1/2 and this to 1/3, you're not going to see what I'm talking about as much as 1/6, 3/6, and 2/6 because then they'll all up to 6. And same concept. The menu goes down 1 and the footer takes up the rest of it. And you'd actually put whatever the footer is in here, you know, created by me, right? And then if you have more text, you should just stretch to fill it. So if I had a whole bunch of stuff inside of the main, let's use this. Let's add a BR to it, and then some more info, and then add another BR. And then I'll copy this a few times so you can kind of see what happens when you get more of this, right? Again, it just stretches. So this is going to take up these 2 rows no matter how much information is in there. So that's kind of the concept how this works. The key is setting it up correctly, getting those names so that you can build this area. So this is definitely a and again, these defaults, these blue and these things, it's just what they use, right? So don't get hung up on all of this. Again, that's why the font's so big. And that's all of the things. So if you get rid of the background color, it's not going to, it's just, you don't see that, right? Exactly. This is why they have the, and I can get rid of the gap. So now it's still, this is taking up this whole spot. You just can't see it. So it still has the same layout. The reason they give all of those information is so you can actually see what it looks like. Otherwise, it just looks like that. So if we put that all back, now you can actually see all that information in your web page. You don't, the default grid doesn't do that by default, I guess is what I'm getting at. Grid does not add all that stuff by default. People just do that so you can see what it looks like. So that's the grid layout with using the area, template area. So now we're going to learn the easier way. But when we do our challenge, and then I showed you this one first, when we do our challenge, you can do this with all of this with grid, what I just taught you. So I want to kind of see you do that for this, right? I want you to use grid area to make this. So that's the same concept as with different layouts, but you have to use grid to do this one. So we kind of just showed you how to do that one. Now in theory, you could do what you did with flex blocks, but would be really pointless at that point. Because when we go down here, you can see I can easily just as easy as I can make 9, I can make, you know, just 2 across using some simple concepts that we're about to show down here, and then put a div above it and a div below it, and essentially copy Flexbox. But I want you to try to use the actual grid area to set it up like I have on that one, and then, you know, add your information to it. And we'll go into this one because this is kind of useful as well. And this does make it nice when you want those extra rows, right? So let's go ahead and watch this tutorial real quick. There's a bunch more to watch down here. So I do recommend watching more of the videos. If you get a chance, there's also a nice little link to how-to guides. We'll watch this video and then we'll again play around with the code down here to see how it works. Oops, I'm going to watch from there, watch from here.
Alright, so in the last video we said that CSS Grid gives us the ability to create these grids and place them on a web page. Then we can nest elements inside this grid and place the elements onto the grid like so. Now, this grid has 2 directions. It has rows going across and columns going down. This video is going to focus on the columns. So this example uses 8 columns But if you wanted to, you could have 2 columns, 10 columns, 20 columns. There's no limit as to how small or how large you want your grid to be in terms of how many columns you want in it. So the idea is that we create this grid and we set out the number of columns and the width of each column. Then we can place content onto those columns and say, hey, I want you to span 3 columns in width or 4 columns in width. Also, in this example, every column has the same width. But in your grid, you don't have to use the same width for every single column. You could have some columns that are 3 times the width of the other column. All right, and we're going to see all this in a minute. So I've already created an index.html file, and inside we have this div with an ID of content. This is going to serve as the actual grid, the grid wrapper, if you like. And then all the elements that we're placing onto the grid go inside it. So we have these 9 divs right here, and each one of them has a number inside of it, so we can see which one they are on the web page. I've also added some very simple styles at the top up here. So the body tag sets a color of white for all the fonts, a font family of Neato semi-bold, and it aligns all of the text to the center. The content, which is going to act as the grid wrapper, has a max width of 960 and a margin of 0 and auto, so it centers it on the page. Then we style the divs themselves. So each div is going to have a background of this kind of light blue color and a padding of 30 pixels. However, each even child div is going to have a background of this kind of charcoal gray color. So this looks something like this in the browser at the minute. Each one of these is a div which takes up 100% in width as default because it's a block level element, and each other div has a different color so we can identify them easily. All right, so now let's create a grid out of this thing right here. We want to say that this is the grid and these are the elements we want to place on the grid, right? So to make a grid, the first thing we need to do is take this wrapper, this content, and say we want it to display as grid. That's simple, display grid. Now this is a grid. And if we save it and view it in a browser, nothing much is going to change. All we're doing here is saying that this is going to be a grid, but we still need to define our columns inside this grid. Because at the minute, it doesn't really have any columns. It's just one element on top of another. But say, for example, we want to give this grid 4 columns, or 3 columns even, so that each row across has 3 elements in it, right? So the way we do this is by using a property called grid-template-columns. Okay? Now we can define our different columns inside this property. Now I said we're going to use 3 columns, and I want each column to be roughly the same width. So I'm going to say 33.3% for the first column, 33.3% for the second column, and 33.3% for the third column. So right here we're saying we want 3 columns because we provided 3 numbers, and each column is going to be the same width, 33.3%. They add up to just nearly 100%. So if I save this now, view this in a browser, we can see that voila, we've made this grid with 3 columns going across. So each element sits inside one of these columns, and then it automatically creates a new row when it needs to, because we have 9 elements, but there's only 3 columns, right? So I did say that we could make each different column a different width. We don't always have to have the same width for each column. So let's try that.
All right, so basically the key to this one, right? This is why it's so simple and right up there with Flexbox. I mean, really, it's just one extra line instead of saying display flex. You do have to set up this one extra row. Again, everything else is just for visual effects. But with this, you can set up, and there's a bunch of different ways to do this, but the key is really you display grid, and then you're going to tell them what you want the columns to be. So in this case, 33%, you know, everything's 1/3. But you could do like we did before, 20%, 40/40, or as he's going to play around with some other sizes. But there's, and we'll go into other things. There's other things you could put here as well than percents.
We'll say the first column is going to be 30% in width, the second column 20% in width, and the third column is going to be 50% in width. Save that. And now we can see it's still split up into 3 columns, but they all have different widths. And automatically, these elements have been placed into the positions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inside this grid, okay? So if we leave it like this, then by default, each element is going to take up the column that it's assigned to, right? So the first one is assigned to 30%, the second one assigned to 20%, the third one to 50%, Then we restart. We go into a new row. The fourth one to 30, fifth to 20, sixth to 50, etc. All right. So that's using percentages. But typically what we do now with CSS Grid is use a different unit, and that's called fractionals or fractions, right? So I'm going to get rid of this. In fact, I'll just comment it out so we can see it there later on. And underneath, I'm going to create the same property, grid-template columns, to say which columns we want in this grid. And this time I'm going to use fractions. So say again, we want 3 columns, all the same width. Well, we'd say 1 fraction, so FR for fraction, 1 fraction, and 1 fraction. So we're saying we want all of the columns to be the same fraction in width, the same fraction of the overall grid, if you like. So if I save this and view it in a browser, you can see each column has the same width. Awesome. But if we were to change this and say we want this middle column to have a different width, it's going to be 2 fractions, then what this means is, okay, I want this to be twice as long as this column, right? This is 2 fractions of the overall width. This is 1 fraction of the overall width. So let's view this in a browser, and we can see now this middle column is twice as big. It stretches twice as far. It's 2 fractionals. All right. So I want to show you one more thing. So let's comment this dude out again. And underneath, I'm going to do exactly the same property. I'm just keeping it up here so you guys can see as we go along. So grid-template-columns again. And this time, I'm going to use a repeat function. And what repeat function allows us to do is say we want to repeat something X amount of times, and also say what we want to repeat. So I want to repeat this 3 times because we want 3 columns, and then I'm going to say 1FR. So that is the same as saying 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. Let's just see if this works, and we get exactly the same. Now, the reason this is cool is because say we want 10 columns or 9 columns, I can say repeat this 9 times, 1FR, and now we get a grid with 9 columns. So it just makes writing out the columns much easier. So I'll be using this a little bit as we go through this series.
So again, if you want to watch this series, that's great. We're not going to focus on the repeat. We are going to focus on the FRs though. So I'm going to kind of show you like how we had the 30, 20, 50. How do you get that with FRs? Well, with the 3FR, 2FR, and 5FR will give you the same ratios, right? That is the key to how the FRs work, is try to figure out what the percents are and then divide by 10. And it's going to kind of give you a better, again, the 55 is, we have other fractions. The key is it's got to add up. If you want to make it look like percents, otherwise, again, this doesn't add up to 100%, right? But what it's going to do is this is 25%, 50%, and 25%. So basically the bottom line is when you use FRs, you add up all the FRs, and then each one's a fraction of that. So there's 4, so this is 1/4, 2/4, 1/4. If you had this as 5, then the total will be 8, so it'll be 1/8, 2/8, and then 5/8, right? So again, it's whatever the fraction of it is. So if you add up to 10, then it's a lot easier, right? If this is 10, then this is 10%, 20%, and then that'd have to be a 7, so 70%, right? So let's go ahead.
So there we go.
And look at the example that we have. So I'll full screen this. And we'll play a little bit around with it, right? We started with the auto, which is the same as doing 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. But we could go through and change it around. Let's do it. Like I said, let's do what he had. So I think it was 3, then 2, then 5, right? So 3FR, 2FR, and 5FR. And I think I had it backwards. I think it's 2 and 3. But again, so this is 3/5, 3/10, 3/10, 2/10, and 5/10, right? So we have the ability to go like that. And again, it's however we do this. If we want to add 1FR, now it's 4 across. And now it's actually 3/11, 2/11, 5/11, 1/11 for sizing, and then 9 brings us down to here. We could keep with this concept, and now again we was at 19ths, right? So 3/19, 2/19, 5/19, 1/19, 8/19. So again, and it just wraps around until it's out of divs. If you want more divs, you just keep adding them. So again, we change the contents, but you can, and this is still contents, right? So menu and whatnot, and then you just do, really these columns are way too small to do anything really. So I'm gonna go back to this. So that's the menu there. Maybe this is info. And then you got your main content here, right? Content. So you can add columns, however, make it look what you want to do. But again, it's kind of right now without going in advanced, and again, there's lots of places, videos for you to watch to get to advanced. You essentially made a table for all intents and purposes that you just can easily make the width. But if you don't really need all these other pieces, this alone can be really nice because you can have your menu, and this, I think this is why you had it as 20 and then 30%. So, you know, you have your menu, you can have some other, maybe your photos over here and your main content. And you have the ability to go ahead and set up more divs under it, right? Like we mentioned before, this could be the footer. And you can, you know, give it some of those other little settings that it has. I think I should be able to add this class to it. So again, we have a little footer, right? So there's ability to do a lot of this stuff. It's pretty nice what you can actually do with this. But just realize like this is kind of like Flexbox, where this footer is not actually inside of the grid. So we use the grid to set up this, and then the footer is off to its own. As opposed to when you're able to do that all with the actual code using the area layout. So that is grid in a nutshell. Again, you can CSS tricks to get a little bit more information you can read about. This right here is the playlist. So go ahead, check all this out. There's one more video. This goes into a little bit more advanced because you can technically use grid and rows to accomplish what you can in area. So if you watch this video, I'll go over that. But with that, don't forget to make this using grid area and get that turned in. That's the end of the lesson. We'll see you next lesson.